"10 minutes of managing people through change." 10 minutes on managing people through change. When we've looked at previous sections at areas such as identity and change, we've seen that any kind of intervention in an organisation involves to some degree involving questioning somebody's idea of who they are within the organisation, what their role is, what their relationships are, and indeed even whether they've got a role in an organisation. And that accentuation of uncertainty and questioning is one that implicitly means emotion. Now, typically when people talk about emotion and change, they tend to think about the operational level of those that have change perpetrated upon them as being those that are going to be emotional within there. But I want to look slightly more broadly than that, because implicit when somebody like Mark Wilson stands up as chief executive and makes the pronouncement that they're going to enter the growth phase of their turnaround plan, then it's not just the operational people that look up and say, well, what does that mean for me, and will I have a job at the end of that? It's everybody in the middle as well. So we want to look at middle management and their identity, their emotional work, because it's they that stand as a bridge between strategic intent, what strategy says, and themselves and the individuals at the operational end that they have to work with to deliver that strategy. And indeed, these people might not agree. They might be completely ambivalent to what the message that they're after. They might, however, be constrained in terms of not being allowed to show negative emotions or negative attitudes towards the ideas that are being put forward by the management. And they might be therefore quite resistant, or they might be quite resentful of having to implement strategies that they don't believe in and they don't think are effective or right. So at some level, these people are stuck in the middle of it. They have to be thinking about their employees, the people that they work with and they admire, and also themselves and their own position within it. So they're stuck with what Sims calls a peculiar loneliness between senior members of the organisation and the operatives whom they're supposed to be, who are their colleagues and indeed their peers and friends. So we can recognise immediately that there's going to be emotion, but it's not so obvious what we mean by emotion. Emotions are actually a relatively modern invention. It was only when we got into the Victorian age that people started to have them. Granted, when we get back further in history, we had the humours, we had moods, but we didn't necessarily have emotions in the way that we understand them today, which is quite a head blaster for me. So when we talk about emotions in research terms, we sort of split them up. We talk about emotions as being feelings, things that we are felt within us, and that differs from the what is displayed. So when I made my crazy introduction for this segment, you saw me being contrastingly sad and then elated and happy. And those are displayed properly emotions, even though there might not be an underlying feltness to it. Well, certainly not the happiness. So what I'm doing within there is some kind of play acting, perhaps, but I'm doing some emotional work. I'm doing an emotion work which mediates between what's expected of me in a particular circumstance, or what I want to convey, and what might be underlying the surface. I'll talk about that. Now that's significant because we're going to talk about that in quite a lot of detail when we look at middle manager emotion work through change processes. But I want to later in the next segment then come back and look at psychodynamics. And psychodynamics takes quite a different turn because it's looking at sub and unconscious processes which are driving the felt emotion and the emotional displays. And we'll look at that in the next segment. Clarke's paper, which is the main drive of this section, is an interesting piece of research. She did look at a global aerospace organisation which was going through massive amounts of change. The headquarters where they did the research was going through a downsizing of 50%, so it's huge amounts of people going out of the business, with site managers closing sites going, the whole lot. And what they did was repeat interviews with middle managers as that process went forward across 18 months. And they were just trying to see what's their experience like, what is it that they're having to manage within themselves, never mind what they're trying to manage within the process. And they said when they're looking at this, they said, well, actually our problem is broadly that the models are completely dominated by the idea of the loss transition curve on one hand, and then the unfreeze, move, refreeze model that we've seen before from Kurt Lewin's classic piece of work. Now I have to say, I really do have a lot of difficulty with the loss transition curve, because it isn't a loss transition curve, it's a bereavement curve. It was written about what happens when people of importance die within families. That is completely different from change in an organisation. So although it kind of resonates a lot with our understanding of people feeling like they have had a loss and therefore they will recover them, there's lots of reasons to be slightly suspicious of that. Now, what Clarke and our colleagues found was that actually those are descriptive. They're helpful to an extent, those two, but they intertwine. They're locked together, such that if you looked at what the organisation was doing or what was happening in the organisation, then you could see something of a functional side of actually doing the change, in the sense of mobilising people to do different things, making them prepare or getting people prepared to actually put those things into action, and then sustaining that change going forward. But each of those stages was associated with different tasks that the managers were undertaking. Tasks both in the sense of physically what they were trying to organise, but also tasks in the sense of what they had to manage within themselves. So in the mobilisation stage, what she was discovering is there was quite a lot of emotions, but they tended to be based around the type of relationships that people had, particularly high strength relationships, where people were realising that those were going to be impacted, and therefore there was an awful lot of emotionality over what that would mean for the individual and the relationship between them. That was exacerbated by uncertainty, which amplified the insecurity and therefore the emotions within it. And there was a great deal of vulnerability about roles and what the future might hold within there. So at that mobilisation stage, the people were experiencing trying to make sense of what is the organisation going to do and what will that mean for me, what am I required to do here, but also what does that mean for me in that larger scale, and therefore how do I cope with that. Emotional work at that stage was relatively hidden. In the move stage, there was the starting of the adaptation to change. Things were in train by this stage. People were beginning to understand whether they had a new role or what the new expectations and behaviours were that they were expecting. So there was acceptance of change, and there was some kind of recovery. So there was in some ways the uncertainty had dissipated a little bit, but there was a hell of a lot of tension within the system, and people were feeling enormously stressed by trying to put new ways into action. So the move phase was characterised by emotion work, where people were trying to handle the stress of doing things differently. As they said at the end of the quote that they capture quite nicely, it was a process of working out, trying to make sure that they found the right thing to say and the wrong thing to say in order to ensure that they were on message. In the sustain stage, what they were doing is trying to find some constructions. They were, in Boji's term, trying to narrate what they had explained, what had happened to them, and what they were going forward. So you got those different interpretations and constructions that they went along. So although this was at a completion stage, they themselves would have said it wasn't finished by a long shot. And we would understand that what they meant by that is that the battle over what had happened, the interpretation of history, and how it would unfold was still to be worked out. So what does that mean? Well, I think actually the main message within there is to say that emotionality of change is implicit to identity and identification. It's them as particular managers that means that they have to enact particular things, and therefore emotion and emotion work are part of that stuff. Simultaneously, when change, you've got to pay attention to the doing of change, what is being done, and that doing of change is going to have an impact on emotion and emotion work at the same time. That obviously the degree of uncertainty exacerbates what that situation is. The conditions for emotion are certainly within there, and therefore the requirement for emotional work is extended. But you completely have to see that relationships matter. The motor, both in generating and accentuating emotions, but also in alleviating it, because it's through emotions that we come through relationships we come to understand other people. And emotion work is also an intrinsic part of change. And you need to ensure that there are avenues for people that allow discussion and resolution.